Welcome everyone. We are so grateful that you all are taking about an hour out of your day today to come listen to us all speak. My name is Ian Carr. I am the head of product here at Scrum Alliance, and I will be your host today. I will introduce our four presenters who are going to be walking us through the rest of the questions and conversation that's going to come up today. So I'll start with Nigel Baker. Do you want to introduce yourself, Nigel?
I was too busy reading all the comments. Hello, I'm Nigel Baker. I'm an agile coach and Scrum trainer for the last 20 odd years, working out of Bristol in the UK. So I was hunting down all the British people in the comments.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nigel. Simon, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Simon Orrell. I'm an agile coach, been in this world for close to 20 years. And I am currently in the Canadian Rocky Mountains.
Thank you, Simon. Donald, you're with us here today as well. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Donald Patty. I go by DP, and I'm an agile coach and trainer based out of the Washington, D.C. area in the United States. I saw a couple of folks from the D.C. area. And I have been working with Scrum since late 2006 and decided to go beyond just being a Scrum Master. Actually, I shouldn't say just being a Scrum Master into coaching around 2014.
Well, thank you, Donald. And Adrian, why don't you wrap us up here?
Hi, everyone. I'm Adrian Perot. I'm based off of a tiny little country between Spain and France called Andorra. I first came across Agile around 2004, and I became a consultant around 2012, I'd say, and a certified trainer in 2016 or 17. Don't remember anymore.
That's fantastic. So again, my name is Ian Carr. I'm the head of product here at Scrum Alliance. So it's my duty here to make sure that all of our new products are brought into the market accordingly. I'm also joined by Rebecca Federspiel. Rebecca, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Rebecca Federspiel, and I am the curriculum designer working with this product from the Scrum Alliance side. And I'm coming in from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Rebecca. All right. So we can go ahead and dive right in. Here's what we're going to cover today. We want to talk a little bit about why scaling often fails, and you may end up hearing a story that you can relate to, and maybe that's something that you're going through with yourself or your organization. We're going to talk a little bit about the philosophy of our new product, which is called Certified Agile Skills. It's a scaling level 1 course. We're going to talk about the philosophy there. Really, we're going to talk a bit about who this certification is for as well. And then we're going to dive into the solutions overview. So what does this course actually talk about, and what are you going to learn through it? So the goal here today is to kind of give you an overview of what this new course is and really see if it's the right fit to help you overcome some of the problems that you're facing. So we'll dive in, and we often hear so many different reasons why a scaling solution may have failed in the past. We weren't ready. We didn't know what it takes to scale. We chose the wrong framework. Our approach didn't fit the existing structure. We were too afraid to try. Some of these comments may be very familiar to you, and this is what we at Scrum Alliance heard from so many customers that are out there. We wanted to come up with a solution that kind of can help you fit any framework. So we wanted to build something that was framework agnostic, and we wanted to lean into different methods that are out there. So with that, we kind of found some stories that were really familiar. So I'm going to read through these real quick, and it may be a story that you can relate to. It may be something that you've heard before. So I've spent several years investing in implementing a framework, and I am disappointed I'm frustrated with where we are, and I don't understand why. Or maybe you've been tasked with choosing an approach to scaling for your organization, and your organization already consists of agile teams. How can I choose an approach? So you're in the discovery phase. You're out there looking around. You've been tasked with introducing agility to a large organization. Some scaling frameworks sound really appealing, but you're not sure which one you want to go with. And lastly, the org may be growing. You may be going from a small team to a big team, or to an even bigger team beyond that. So we don't know how we can continue to focus and maintain the effectiveness of a small company as we're continuing to grow. So some of these problems kind of came up, and that's where we started. We started at the root problems to come up with this new solution. So I'm actually going to hand it over to Simon, who's going to bring us through this next section of what is often missing.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the elephant in the room here, and that's really about what's usually missing in these conversations about scaling. When we embark on these endeavors, we're usually borrowing principles and practices from those who've gone before us. And the trouble is that often the context of those who've gone before us at best gets lost in translation, and at worst was never really there in the first place. And I'll give you an example of the so-called Spotify model. Is a classic example of this, right? Trying to copy and paste something that was a snapshot in time for an organization with a very different context than yours, at a different point in their agile journey than yours, is likely, to lead to some troubles. In the end, context is everything here. So what we're going to be talking about today, I'll just cover some 4 sort of key elements that we're going to be looking through. We're trying to help people think differently about scaling, and how your organizational values and your organizational constraints and culture have an impact on what you want to achieve through scaling, and how to approach that scaling in that context, in your context. So when we talk about principle informed, what do we really mean? Well, again, it's about, let's make sure that we're taking into account your principles, your organization's values, your culture, as well as some well understood agile and scaling principles, so that you can use those all together to guide your decision making around discovering what are suitable practices for your context. It's patterns based. And what do we mean by a pattern? We'll get into some of these details later, but essentially we're using the Christopher Alexander definition, which focuses on describing a problem which occurs over and over and over again, and which also describes a core solution that you can then instantiate many, many different ways depending on the context. And again, that's what matters. So we'll be talking some more about patterns later on. Scaffolding. This is a concept where we use temporary structures and practices to help further our journey. And they're intended to help us transition as we evolve our scaling practices. And then finally, the notion that introducing and sustaining change in your context, which is really what scaling is all about, I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear, is probably a fairly complex endeavor. And so let's use what we know is useful in complex problems, which is an iterative, incremental approach, rather than trying to use a predefined and perhaps contextless approach. So there, I'm going to hand it over back to Ian. Oh, no, I'm handing it over to Nigel.
Yes, me. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so I was taught at university many years ago that one of the key things to do before you start any discussion or any analysis is to define your terms. Okay, because the problem is in a lot of the agile space is people are talking at cross purposes. They may be agreeing with each other, but they understand terms and terminology differently, and thus they clash. So one of the key things for us was to define our terms. What does scaling actually mean? What is scaling? And so what we're trying to demonstrate here is when we talk about frameworks, etc., we're not talking about Scrum, the team-based stuff. That's nicely defined. We understand that. And what we're not going to talk about in terms of this workshop is in terms of what some people call business agility. The idea of, and now business agility is a really ill-defined term. It means many different things to many different people. I think I put in the slide here, enterprise agility. That could mean the entire business is agile. It could mean, I don't know, your call center team are using Kanban. That's an incredibly diverse and incredibly interesting, but an incredibly variable area. So what we're talking about here is what I would define as big product agile, large agile, using things like Scrum and Kanban, extreme programming, multi-team product development is the problem we're really trying to solve here with this workshop and with this seminar, to help us really get a handle on that big agility in our organizations. And next up, it is Adrian.
It's me. All right. So we hope that all of you here are people that fall into some of these categories. But we often say when we talk about transformation or scaling, etc., that we need upper management support, which is definitely the case. But the executives, which are the ones that kind of desire this change to be made so that they can fulfill their purposes of building great products for their industry, they're not the only ones that will be part of putting in place scaling. We also need coaches that facilitate the change, that they bring in the experience from other organizations, understanding the context that made those changes possible in on one organization, seeing what matters into the other organization. Also, we need to take into account middle managers. Middle managers are probably the most undervalued people in agility in general. We fail to see how they are useful if we only think about Scrum. But when we're talking about multi-team Scrums, when we're talking about, as Nigel said, bringing agility to multi-team product development, middle managers are key to help us put it in practice. And then at the team level, we'll have the agilists, be the product owner, Scrum masters. All of these people are necessary if we want to bring forward agility at scale in product development. And it's all of these people that need to understand the approach that we're trying to bring forward, because otherwise, if they're not aligned, if they just think, oh no, we're just going to copy and paste, as Simon mentioned earlier, that's not going to work. Therefore, we're hoping that you're in this category and that you can get other people in this category in your organizations to understand what we want to teach you here.
That's excellent. Thank you, Adrian, Simon, and Nigel. So before we dive into the three sections, I wanted to just take a moment to take a step back and kind of go through what it is that we're trying to do here. I am a big fan of telling stories, and I am a big fan of metaphors. So I am going to give you a story in the form of a metaphor. And I think this should help kind of set up the context for the rest of today's conversation. So here's a really good example of how this new scaling solution from Scrum Alliance could work. So, your company is poised to lead the landscaping industry with a growing demand for eager customers. To meet the surge and establish yourself as one of the premier landscaping companies, you start looking into how you're going to train your teams so that you can deliver lots of results at a large scale. So you start doing some discovery and you start coming across a lot of really, really good examples, perfect examples even, great landscaping. And we're going to call these examples just big frameworks. These big frameworks are really portrayed as magnificent estates. They're in magazines and they really do appear breathtaking. You want to be able to replicate these. So you start diving in and you read more on the article, and it's a really prescribed model. It says you need 10 landscapers to keep up with this. You need 3 different watering systems, and you need exactly 30 acres of land and other things that are unbelievably specific. Ultimately, the article implies there is replicability, so you can replicate it as much as you want. But there are definitely some concerns from you as a small business owner that's growing around some of the funding. Some of the funding seems really challenging. And you're also hearing more and more from your clients that you really want to have diverse, different examples. So where the certified agile skills, this scaling level 1 from Scrum Alliance starts coming in, is it's more of a training program. It's a toolkit. It allows you to cultivate and be adaptive, have sustainable landscaping. Beyond the initial design, it actually trains the knowledge and understanding of soil, of tending the diverse plants' needs, adapting to changing seasons and climates. It teaches you how to recognize patterns like continuously fertilizing, tailored specific to seasons and regions. So we really want to introduce principles, and that's part of this product. So we're going to come back in now, and we're going to take a look at the 3 different sections in this new certification course that we're offering. We're going to look at scaling. We really want to make sure that we define it, what it is, why, and maybe even why not. We're going to look at patterns, finding patterns within your organization, and knowing what frameworks that are out there that may actually fit your company or yourself perfectly. And then lastly, what scaling successfully and sustainably can look like. So I'm going to dive into this next section, and I'm going to be asking our host to answer some questions. So I'm going to start with Simon. Scaling, what is it? Why? Why don't you give me your thoughts on this?
All right, thanks, Ian. Well, effectively, scaling in the context that we're talking about here is trying to maintain the benefits of agility when you move from a single team to multiple teams that are working on a product. And as many of you know, this can be very, very challenging. I think it's important that we understand that where a lot of problems arise comes from understanding why we want to scale at all, right? From my experience, I have found that a lot of organizations, some teams that I've worked with, if they think that becoming agile is the goal, that's where we start with the biggest problem. Agility is not the goal. Scaling is not the goal. The goal is about some business value that we're having trouble getting more of in our current state. And so I think it's super important that we talk about what is it that we're trying to accomplish through this thing that we think is called scaling. Because don't forget, scaling is a solution to a problem. So you need to have a pretty good understanding, if you're going to try and come up with a solution, of what problem you're trying to solve in your context. I'm going to let Nigel speak a little bit about scaled versus scaling versus descaling.
Yeah, because this is really interesting and something I spotted a while ago, which is we talk a lot about scaling, in terms of scaling, but most of what we actually have out in industry today is scaled. It's pre-built, it's configured by someone else. And there's not enough talk about, life is the journey, not the destination. And that journey we go on, that it's happening now. Scaling is changing, scaling is evolving, scaling is growing, scaling is transforming. These are all really important aspects to understand that our approach, by its very nature, as you grow, as you change, your approach needs to grow and change. And the sort of pre-built static model is not fit for purpose for that, right? So the difference between sort of scaled, pre-made, that may not be right for us, maybe right for someone else, but for us, we may need to go onto that journey, to go on that evolution. And of course, the third part of this is, why not? A lot of our problems are probably caused by our size itself. So there's a huge conversation that we're having in the agile space about descaling. And what do we mean by that? I don't mean descaling a fish. What I mean is, what can we take out? What can we remove? What extra complexity has been generated by our systems that if we remove, we make people's lives better? Now, it's important to understand, and we'll come to change later, that descaling shouldn't mean people losing their jobs. I saw some concern in the comments about middle managers standing in the way of change, especially first line managers. And I can understand that, because if they feel their job's under threat, of course you would resist a change. Who wouldn't? And that isn't what descaling is about. Descaling is about making better, smoother, more refined organizations, not slimming organizations, so to speak. And so these three prongs are three aspects of the trident that is this course, and the three aspects that we're going to have to consider as we go along. What do you think, Adrian?
Yeah, I wanted to chip in there because, I don't know if you've read the book. There's a really good book by Craig Lammer and Bas Bodde, and they start the book almost by saying that after all their years of experience in scaling, their recommendation is don't do it. There has to be a really good reason to scale. Scaling adds complexity. You have all these teams that now you need to coordinate. It requires all these new ceremonies. There's overhead in adding processors to your machine. It's not like you just add 20 more teams and you get 20 more capacity. It doesn't work that way. So if you can avoid that complexity, then go for it. Descaling is one way to do it. Another way to do it is just hire brilliant people that can do everything that you need in a single team and just stay with that. But sometimes that's not possible. There's two really good reasons for which we need to scale. The first one is just cognitive load. Sometimes your product is so complex, so complicated. It requires so much knowledge to actually do it. I don't know, like a fighter jet. You can't have a single team do everything that a fighter jet needs to do. That's too much complexity for a single team's brain's capacity. In that case, you might need multiple teams. Or another reason might be that there's market pressures that are driving things to go faster to the market. And whoever hits the market first is going to get a lot of users, and you want to be that team. Therefore, you might want to increase capacity. But you have to know that that capacity is not free. There's costs that need to go with it. Therefore, there needs to be a good reason for it.
Great, Adrian. Don, any last thoughts on why, what, and why not for scaling?
Yeah, just specifically on descaling. When I think of descaling, one of the things I think of is Conway's Law, which essentially says that the systems or solutions that you build are influenced or even to some degree determined by the structure of your organization. And so descaling becomes an effort to build better solutions, better products by having I'll say a better structure to your organization, one that minimizes bureaucracy and avoids unnecessary rules. So it's not about the people who are in place, but it's about the rules, the policies, the structure that might be in place that is inhibiting you from being more effective. And I think there needs to be a key emphasis on that, as well as on scaling, taking a look at your organization and seeing what is preventing you from being, quite honestly, more agile.
Thank you for very much. That's very helpful as we dive into this next section. So our next section is actually focused on using patterns and utilizing frameworks in order to scale. So Don, since you were talking, I'm actually going to let you continue the conversation and dive right in. How do you define patterns, and what are some anti-patterns that you have seen?
Sure. So you mentioned principle informed. I'm actually going to jump on that a bit and how principles fit into this. So I think initially about the Scrum values. I mean, you have respect on there, which is one of the Scrum values. And immediately it comes to mind the fact that I've seen a scaling effort that was frankly failing simply because there was a lack of respect amongst the various different teams and the different team members. So when we talk about principle informed, that's the type of thing we're talking about, is making sure that the fundamental principles are there for you to be successful with Agile. And as you scale, realizing that those challenges are going to become greater. Now, you also mentioned patterns and, being pattern led. So if we take that assumption that a pattern is a core solution to a common problem, then it gives us a good idea of what we're trying to do, very context specific and frankly, very agile, right? So we're looking at the problem we're facing or the challenge that we're facing, and we're saying, hey, what techniques have shown or demonstrated to be successful? So when we talk about pattern led, that's what we are talking about. Now, you mentioned anti-patterns. So if we go with the thought that an anti-pattern is a dysfunction or a misuse or misapplication of a pattern, meaning that we are either overextending it or using it at the wrong time or the wrong place. I'd say the most common anti-patterns I see at scale are, the one that comes immediately to mind is overcoaching. Okay. And coaches being actually too active and putting too much emphasis on the rules or the practices that are there within, say, a framework versus on whether or not those are the right rules to have in place or the right practices to be using, and allowing some flexibility there. I'd say that's probably the biggest one. Does that help, Ian?
That helps a lot. Nigel, what are your thoughts on finding patterns and frameworks that can help scale?
It's such an interesting area, patterns, and the idea has been around a long time. I've got the book sat next to me where it was originally mentioned, a pattern language. Now, don't go buy this book because it's about construction, about city planning, but this idea of finding these shapes that are repeated again and again and again, these ideas that seem to work again and again and again is a really important idea. And so for me, in terms of this, what we're trying to do in this course is not just give you a big pile of patterns. You can imagine that would just be, there could be infinite number of patterns out there. The idea of this course, the idea of this workshop, and in fact this philosophy behind the course, is that we want to teach people to go out and source patterns, to find the best places for these ideas, to know. We'll talk you through some of those sources, some of those libraries, and be able to judge them, judge the pros and cons of these patterns, and then actually apply them successfully in your organization in a way that is not dangerous or damaging. And I think that idea is really key, because a lot of frameworks in the past, they get bought and sold, but a lot of frameworks, they collect a lot of patterns, these frameworks, but it doesn't make everything in a framework a pattern. There's also other things like just standard practices, good ideas, maybe bad ideas, anti-patterns wrapped into those frames. And so being able to pick out the bits that are appropriate and the bits aren't is really important, but all from an agile point of view. We're not drawing patterns from outside the agile space. The final thing I would say is, I think Don made some really good points about anti-patterns earlier on, or dark patterns. I think one of the key things I regard as an anti-pattern is people that seem to think they can overcome low quality with volume. So they think, okay, we don't make stuff very well, but if we get 9 teams making it, well, I'm afraid to say you'll have 9 teams making it not very well. And so there is an element of craft, there's an element of discipline around scaling, there's an element of being able to do stuff well. And so I think in terms of the pattern world, we'll be looking at that as well.
Adrian, do you have any thoughts you would like to share?
Yeah, sure. I would like to start with a quote by Groucho Marx, which is, "Those are my principles, and if you don't like them, well, I have other ones." Okay, so what I wanted to say with this is, well, all these scaling frameworks have principles. If you don't like them, go look for other ones. You have to find principles that help you scale, that are consistent with whatever your organization's principles and values are. If you try to plaster over your organization principles that don't match up, it's not going to work. So do as Groucho. If those principles you don't like, go find other ones that help. Okay. And then when selecting patterns, I wanted to actually give a couple of examples of what we could mean by patterns. One example, which is seen in, I think, more than one framework of scaling, is the scaled daily scrum. Scaled daily scrum, meaning that all the teams are doing their daily scrum every day, and right after they send a representative to have a scaled daily scrum, which would facilitate coordination, bottleneck removal, etc., etc. Now, this could easily become an anti-pattern if we, instead of sending team members that are working on things that are dependent on one another, we send managers to do management work in a scaled management coordination meeting. So you can see how easily a pattern that could be useful according to context can become an anti-pattern when done to kind of foster things that are not meant to be fostered. Another example of a pattern that I could think of would be, for example, synchronizing sprints. Having sprints be synchronized, so all the teams are doing sprints starting and ending at the same day. That might be useful, but there might be some contexts where there's not a lot of dependencies between teams, where it might become more cumbersome than the help it does. So remember, there's plenty of these patterns. You could use the frameworks as sources of patterns, but make sure that the context is right and that you actually need to use that.
I think that's really, really helpful to hear. Simon, I was going to ask you, what are some of the logistical scaling challenges that you've seen in the past, and anything else you wanted to add to this section?
Well, I think when we think about the logistics, what we're really talking about has to do with what are some of the constraints that people come across all the time that have to do with, well, how is your organization set up? And where are the silos in your organization? And how does that impact the various practices and perhaps patterns that you might want to adopt? So we really are trying to focus on helping people where they are, not assuming that they're in an idyllic state in order to scale. of course, we are constantly wanting to be aware of if you're dysfunctional, we want to be careful not to scale the dysfunction that you currently have. So a big part of this course is really about helping people be aware of where you are, and then helping people figure out what kinds of practices that you can derive from patterns are applicable for where you are. And, you know, I can't stress enough, like, that there's nothing bad inherently about the frameworks that already exist out there. It's that they are not necessarily as rote applicable for where you are. So now we're trying to help people figure out, well, so now what do I do? And the idea of this course is really to help people through the thinking of which parts of this apply to me. And as we'll talk about in a minute, what can we do from a temporary perspective to help move us along to get us to be as effective as we can with that pattern.
I think that is a great segue to the last section of the first level 1 scaling from Scrum Alliance, but that's scaling successfully and sustainably. So Simon, if you want to just dive right in, feel free to keep the conversation going.
Sure. I think that there's a lot to be said. There has been a lot said already about the difference between using something that's static, using an approach that's static, using an approach that's perhaps predefined already. And, you know, we believe that scaling is an ongoing exercise. It's about growth. It's about change and change management. And I think what's really important here is that we understand that because context is king, if you try to use things that are in fact already pre-canned, shall we say, you may, and very often, will find that you're in the wrong context for this. So scaling successfully hinges on starting to understand where we're trying to go given where we are today, and then using an iterative incremental approach to that scaling. I'm going to let, let's see, Donald, do you want to talk a little bit about scaffolding?
Sure, absolutely. So scaffolding is essentially temporary structures that help us to become more agile. We use them during the time period during which we need to change, and then we can actually remove them or move beyond them as we grow and evolve. So some of my favorite types of scaffolding are setting up something like, say, an agile practice or a coaching group, which could, frankly, be made up of the Scrum Masters from the organization, helping to identify ways to scale successfully. I think that's a great one. And then once that group, that whether it's an agile practice or you want to call it a center of excellence or something of that sort, once that group has served its purpose, it can actually ultimately dissolve as that knowledge is spread throughout the organization.
I'll jump in here. Because Ian and I look so similar. I'll just take over here. But I think, yeah, this is such an interesting point. Scaffolding is something far larger than, we didn't invent it. It comes from complexity science. It's been around in education for years, but it's something that's missing from a lot of other conversations. The idea of the transitory nature of good practice, that practices age, some mature over time, some practices become valid for you as you gain abilities, and some practices that really help you at the start actually fade in validity, they decay as you gain in experience and maturity as an organization. And too often with a frame or framework, this is all communicated two-dimensionally, like a snapshot of time. This is the answer, but what's the question? And actually what we're trying to communicate here is that three-dimensional journey, time, and experience is such an important factor here, and such an important factor on your context. And this is why transformation is so hard. You know, I think I said before, but most agile transformations fail, not because of agile, but because of the transformation, the approach people are taking whilst changing. And so this course is this workshop, in fact, your lives should be equally devoted to good change leadership and change management, just as much as knowing agile terminology, jargon, and patterns. Because a lot of the patterns in our world of work that really help us improve our world of work are not about product development, they're about organizational change. And if we can understand some of these patterns, and frankly, some of these anti-patterns, that can really, really help us have a richer tool set, a richer understanding, and turbo boost our chances of success. So I think that's really critical for us here, and that's why we've placed it out there for you.
You know, it's interesting. Something you mentioned, Nigel, triggered a thought, which is the idea that these are temporary structures or transitional. So I recently worked with a client who they've been using big room planning, PI planning quite a bit, and they feel like maybe they've moved beyond the need for it. I think initially it was the right thing for them because they wanted to synchronize across multiple teams as they were doing their work scaling. And this made it possible for them to do that. But now they probably don't need to spend that time doing that. They are already, I hate to say innately or inherently synchronized. They've gotten the benefits out of doing that, and they no longer need to be same place, same time to do that. And so to me, that's a good example of a scaffold, either big room planning or perhaps PI planning fitting that mold. And again, it's going to depend on where you are as an organization. In some cases, you will want to keep that indefinitely.
I find there's two underlying theories that basically guide all of our thinking in this workshop. One of them is complexity theory that was mentioned earlier by Nigel. And here, if you haven't learned about the Cynefin framework by Dave Snowden, you should definitely give it a look. But there's two types of there's the ordered scenarios and the unordered. So the ones that we can predict the future for and the ones that we can't. The thing is, most scaling frameworks or scaled frameworks think of the problem of scaling as a predictable one. So they give you the solution that will work. And if you apply it, you'll get the benefits. Whereas the way we see it is this is not predictable. We can't really predict what's going to happen to a group of tens or even hundreds of people if you start applying changes. Therefore, what we know in the Agile community is that Agile is really good for solving complex problems. Therefore, our proposal is that we should use Agile to become Agile at scale. You should use the principles of Agile, working iteratively and incrementally to deliver those organizational changes that will help you deliver products at scale. That's one thing. The other one is, okay, so how do we prioritize? How do we define a backlog of changes to make? And the other theory that can help is the theory of constraints. Find what your bottleneck is in your value chain and fix that. And then see if that's still your bottleneck and do some more work. And when that stops being your bottleneck, look for your next bottleneck and start fixing bottlenecks until you get the desired level of performance.
No, I hope what is coming through here is this notion that this scaling is an extremely important term, because what it means is that you're never done. Right? Things are going to be changing all the time, whether it's from a business perspective, from a how you define value perspective, from people leaving your organization perspective, from organizational structure. Things will continue to be changing. And the idea is, of course, is that we want to get you in a place where you are continually evaluating, are we delivering the most value we can? What could we do next in order to help that purpose?
So great. Nigel or Don, any last thoughts?
The only one I would say, and I think we said it a few times before, but scaling is changing and changing is scaling. They're two sides of the same coin. And so a lot of the tools we need to have in this world are of those two worlds to actually help us succeed in fact, scaling, the word could be growing a bigger product, growing a better organization, growing a better experience. And that's why this type of learning is needed in the industry. And it's why this is not aimed at a small, narrow group of just Agile coaches. This really is designed for everyone in the organization to take part and contribute their part to improving their own world of work.
Don, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think it just echoes what Nigel was saying, which is don't underestimate the importance of managing change when you're scaling, because there is change going on within your organization, change that's going to impact the way in which people work and their lives. And that is going to trigger some natural resistance or friction unless you are proactive about it. So it's not just about knowing what the end state is and forcing it through.
Excellent. So I think some of the big takeaways, specifically around the 3 sections of this new course, so really it is focusing on what scaling is, what it's not, and if scaling is even the right solution. It really helps you as a big key contributor understand what patterns are, how to look for patterns, and some of the frameworks that are out there that will help you go through this continuous growth and change. And then lastly, it really helps you set up what a definition of success could look like and how to make it sustainable as well. So these courses are actually going to begin in January, only 1 month away. We're really excited for them. The QR code here will actually take you to the page on the Scrum Alliance website. Down on the bottom, you can actually sign up for updates. So when those courses are live, we will send you an email and let you know when it's available. It is going to be a 2-day course minimum, delivered by trainers that have extreme experience within scaling. So just like the other Scrum Alliance products, we have a really high bar set for the experience that our trainers are giving. We are going to be doing a Q&A session. So if you look on your little Zoom menu, you're going to see a little session there that says Q&A. Feel free to type a question in there and we will do our best to get to it. So we'll actually start by diving into those questions right now. And I'm going to let whoever feels most equipped to answer it jump on and answer. If not, I get to pick on one of you, which may be just as fun. So any advice on how to prevent a scaffold from becoming institutionalized?
So I'm going to jump straight in there because I was looking at that. I've been looking at that one lovingly the entire time it's been up there. Because, yeah, I think someone's made a really good point in the comments. You could have periodic reviews of your scaffolds to make sure they're still fit for purpose. Personally, what I've been doing in real life is using on a lot of my good practices, basically use by dates, and best before dates off of products. So the idea is that a best before date is basically the product's still eatable after the best before, but check it. And so I've been putting those on actual events and on practices. So they're effectively timing out, or at least we're having these expiry dates on these methods. So we go back and revisit them and check them, and see, are they still adding? Are they still fit for purpose? So the culture is not a culture of continuous addition. The culture is of simplicity, maximizing the amount of work you don't do. And what can you remove? What can you take from this? What can drop away over time? So those are 2 things that I've been doing in real life before this, and I find them very powerful. Because otherwise, your beautiful transitional scaffolding will just turn into someone else's bad practice that's been in the organization too long.
And I would add here that be intentional that these are scaffolds for a start. And part of that is if we're trying to transition into a different state, have some clarity around, well, what are you trying to transition to and how would you know whether that had happened? And at least having some sort of notion of the answers to those questions helps you when you're thinking about, oh, do we actually need this anymore? Or has this become sort of cemented for the wrong reason? Part of that is going to be because we haven't been intentional yet about where are we trying to go and how would we know if we gotten there? And this thing is going to help us get there, but it's temporary.
So it's interesting that you mentioned this challenge with scaffolds that don't go away. This sounds like government to me, and I live in the DC area, so we see this a lot and deal with it a lot on multiple levels. It's a hard one to deal with. And for example, I used the term agile practice earlier, alternative name center of excellence. The moment you use that term, it's like, are we excellent yet? And if we're not excellent, maybe it's just going to last indefinitely, right? So that could be a problem in and of itself. Well, there is a solution in government to this. And when it's applied, it usually works generally pretty well, which is in government, they call it a sunset law. But basically it says that something automatically expires by default unless it's explicitly renewed. And so in this case, if you're setting up a scaffold of some sort, give it an automatic expiration and only allow it to continue to persist if it's proving to continue to be of value for you. Okay, and that's going to force you to revisit it.
You know, I said best before. Well, that's the use by date, and you
Yeah,
don't
there you
iterate
go.
after the use by date.
I would like to add another one in there, which is it doesn't always work, but it helps, which is instead of creating new positions for people to fill, create roles for people to do for a while. So the naming here is it might depend on context, but what you're trying to say is you're not creating a position for somebody to get promoted into, because that's dangerous. Once you get promoted into something, it's hard to undo that situation. Instead, you create roles which are temporary by default, and they have a term. So as it has been said with the sunset law, you have a term for, let's say, 6 months that you are whatever role is needed for this scaffold. And after those months, then that goes for re-election.
And that's true, not even for scaling, just for us simple mortals on a 7-person Scrum team. I remember when I first became a Scrum Master, and the conversation basically was, do you want to be Scrum Master? And I said, is it more money? And they said, yes. And I said, I've always wanted to be a Scrum Master. And I jumped in with both feet. But what if I disliked it? There was no reversing. There was no getting out of jail. And so any form of try before you buy is really important in the agile space. We talk about safe to fail experiments, but you kind of want them to be reversible. So it's not just safe to fail, but you can actually take it back out. And that's where a lot of issues people have with scaling. Their idea of scaling is crossing a bridge, burning themselves, and then wondering why everything's gone wrong. There's got to be reversibility. There's got to be survivability. There's just got to be sensible, agile practice in everything we do.
Yeah, and I think I want to echo something that the phrase that Adrian just used about maybe the scaffolding, maybe it doesn't work. Let's not forget that all of this is about, we like to try some things, but you need to have an understanding of how would you know if it worked, right? Which means you're constantly thinking about the intentionality of this scaffolding or this approach or this pattern, right? And so it's really important that there's no guarantees to this. We are evolving this based on, is it taking us closer to where we want to go? Which again, presupposes that you have, a really good idea of what you're trying to accomplish and where you're trying to go. So yes, this is about experimentation. Some of these scaffolds, you might find this isn't actually taking us where we want to go. Okay, good that we're actually thinking about that. Let's move, let's reevaluate. Is there another question we want to take in the next few minutes?
Yeah, I thought this one spoke specifically to some of the anti-patterns. So do you think instead of continuously looking for how to scale Agile, maybe just recognize sometimes it's not worth it? I mean, if you use Agile to approach uncertainty, don't you think scaling Agile will be similar to scaling uncertainty?
Yeah, well, there's a really interesting conversation here, which is some people confuse big with lots. So they confuse, okay, we've got lots of products going in lots of directions we need to scale with, we have one big monster product that we're developing. And when things are lots, there's a whole different set of conversations here. You know, a friend of mine from decades ago now, Kerry Buckley, I once heard him have a conversation when I worked for British Telecom, that small internet startup. And he was saying, they said, look, Kerry, you want British Telecom, big phone company, to be like a gazelle. And what we really need is we're an elephant. So what we really need is a faster moving elephant. And quick as a flash, Kerry said, no. What we need is a herd of gazelle. And so in terms of the conversation we're looking for here, we're not just talking about everything has to be big. That's only certain subsets. Also, we need to talk about lots. How do multi-teams work together with multiple products and flow together like a herd of deer, like a murmuration of birds? And that's a conversation, again, a lot of people aren't having. They're looking all about organizations and structures and not enough about decoupling, descaling, and letting people run free and flow around each other. Adrian referenced this earlier on in terms of sprint alignment, but it comes up again and again and again. And so scaling agility doesn't necessarily mean scaled agility. It could mean descaling, decoupling, and releasing teams to go the directions they need to go within an organization.
Fantastic. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, I think if I understand its question here, I really feel like this is all about uncertainty, right? Taking an agile approach, taking an iterative incremental approach is about trying to deal with uncertainty. And so, yes, if we're faced with uncertainty, let's take an iterative incremental approach so we can learn along the way. If we're not faced with uncertainty, I'll have the same answer that I would have for a single team that's not facing much uncertainty. We've done this a million times before. We know what we're doing. Okay, well, actually, it doesn't matter whether you use an iterative incremental, perhaps, in that particular problem space. But this is why we are talking about Cynefin and complexity, is because we are trying to, for most of us, we are dealing with an uncertain world, a lot of complexity. And so if we're taking iterative incremental approaches to those problems, when we go to scale, we probably shouldn't deviate from that. We should take an iterative incremental approach to how we face that complexity.
Great. And I think we have time for maybe one more question before we wrap up. And I thought this one's really relevant because this is something that we have seen and heard 100 times. How do you get commitment from the C-level? Don, I'm gonna. Oh, Nigel jumped on first. I'm gonna let Nigel.
I was going to jump on first to get the cheesy answer in, which is for a lot of C-level people, they're just human beings like everyone else. What they want is evidence and proof. They don't want theory. They don't want smoke and mirrors. They want to see success. And so in change management 101 is you have to generate success early and often to demonstrate the validity of the ideas. You may start small, that's fine, but you have to keep being able to do that. There needs to be no sort of gamble, no sort of, oh, trust me, it'll be okay in the end. It may not be okay in the end. So you need to be able to demonstrate value and success and learning and in a language that they understand. And again, this is why we spent a lot of time actually in the course design talking about changing, like how we do that, some of the best practice for that. We talked about using agile to be agile, but there's a whole lot more to that in the workshop than this. But I think that's really important. Otherwise you're relying on trying to convince and cajole when all you really want to do is just get facts. Because last thing I want to say on this is there's nothing quite like bringing facts to an opinion fight. Because everyone's got an opinion. Your boss has got an opinion, their boss has got an opinion, the highest paid person's opinion, the hippo, everyone's got an opinion. But if you've got proof, that trumps opinions 9 times out of 10. So that's what I always try to do.
Shall I go?
Please.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay. So my suggestion is get your hands on a copy of the organization's strategy, ConOps, whatever you want to call it, and relate your message, your pitch to that. Align it with what they're trying to achieve as an organization, align it with those goals. Because scaling or agile or a combination of scaling and agile is a means to those ends, not the end. You're not trying to scale for the sake of scaling. You're scaling to help the organization be more effective to achieve those strategic goals.
And if I may, I would just say that commitment for the C-levels is actually shorthand for something that's quite important, which is commitment to make decisions that are congruent with where we're trying to go. And So that's why it's very, very important that at all levels of the organization, we understand where we're trying to go with this effort. Because if the goal is to scale, well, we don't have a lot of focus there. If the goal is to get more of something, to get less of something, to be able to reduce our time to market, if we're starting to talk about what those goals are, then what we're really then looking at is getting decisions from the C-suite that are congruent with achieving those results, not the activities of scaling. We want decisions that are congruent with the results of that scaling.
To add to that, and I really like the point about Don's idea about finding the strategy and pitching something that aligns to that. And I find that the approach that we're bringing forward in this in this CAS S1 is much easier to sell to a C-level than putting framework, whatever you want to put in, because that typically means a big change impacting lots of people, hard to undo, that requires a lot of training for it's a big budget that you're asking for a C-level to put in place X framework. Now, what we're saying is start little, do an experiment, gather data, see how that helps the organization get closer to the strategy. And with that data, say like, okay, so you need a lot less commitment up front. It's like, I'm just going to try something with a couple of teams. Does that work? That's a lot easier commitment than I want to do framework X with 100 teams, right? So you do that, you experiment, you show the data. With that data, the C-level has more weight to push those experiments forward, coming into more things to fix, right? So basically is start small, show that the progress is in the right direction, and get commitment little by little. You don't want to go all out. You don't want to ask for marriage on your first date, basically. So go little by little, get more and more commitment, and show them that this is the right direction.
And Adrian made a great point there, because I just look back at the question, how can we get the commitment from the C-levels? Well, with this type of work, we don't need commitment. We just need a little bit of permission. And when they start seeing the results and they start seeing the success and start seeing alignment, then the wedding, they come with the wedding band, not you. And I think that's a really powerful place to be.
Oh, that is so helpful.